name is David Greenwood. I'm going to talk this afternoon about a presentation I'm calling The Art of Deception. And really what I want you to go away having listened to this presentation is understanding how you can use deception techniques to source high-value threat intel. So a little bit about me before we start. I work in the product team here at Anomali, and I'm really interested in psychology and why people act the way they do, and often act irrationally. So that applies to everyone, right? No one in the room is what I would deem normal, right? We all have our own quirks, and I'm more quirky than anyone. But when we talk about deception, initially people come up and associate it with bad connotations. Does anyone know who that is on the screen there?
Bernie Madoff. No,
Sorry?
It's not Bernie Madoff?
No, it's not Bernie.
The guy who did the defrauded airlines.
Oh,
Catch Me If You
Catch Me If You Can, right.
Yeah, so a guy called Frank Abagnale.
We're the same age, though, aren't they?
Yes, you've probably seen the movie with Leonardo DiCaprio, who doesn't look anything like that in the movie. This is that's actually quite a current photo. He does a lot of tech talks now. He goes around to big tech companies and talks about his story and tells them sort of the same sort of storyline as the movie. I've seen him talk quite a few times, and it's quite inspiring. But for those of you who haven't read the book or seen the movie, Frank Abagnale essentially was probably one of the most well-known deceivers of his time. I think he took the identity or took the profession of 9 different jobs, from an airline pilot to a doctor to a lawyer to many others, right? He was very good at deceiving people to the point where he would get free trips around the world pretending to be a pilot. And again, being a doctor, he would rock up at hospitals to get free prescriptions. And stories of deception like this are very popular in Hollywood, right? Stories like Jordan Belfort, the Wolf of Wall Street, right, who deceived many people with his penny stocks, as well as movies like Ocean 11. And I think I saw on the plane there's an Ocean's 8 now, which is like a woman a version with just all women, which is great. But Hollywood loves those type of stories, and it kind of goes with the whole idea that deception is often given a bad name. But there's another side of deception, and deception can be used for good reasons, right? I mean, if you read some of the synonyms here, deceitfulness, double dealing, fraud, fraudulence, right? We all work in security, we're used to these type of terms. But again, there's craftiness, willingness, artfulness, right? Deception has a good side, and it can be used for good. And when you start looking at deception in detail, there's tons of interesting stories and ways in which people have gone about confusing or deceiving the enemy. So if you take a look closely at this photo, you see there's actually 4 guys holding up this tank here. So this is a picture taken during World War II. So some of you might be aware of the Ghost Army. It was a brigade of troops. There was about 1,000 of them in total. And this troop was tasked solely with deceiving the German front lines. So they had an arsenal of different techniques to do this, from blow-up tanks to runways they would construct, all the way up to fake radio communications. They would pretend to be communicating over the radios, knowing the Germans would be listening in, to confuse where they would put their troops, right? So the Allies were fighting on one front and the Ghost Army were fighting on another, essentially splitting the German front line into 2, or at least with the intention of splitting the front line into 2. And they've largely been credited with helping to win the war. The endeavors these guys went through and sort of the scale of their deception was so big that it did live up to what they were trying to achieve, and essentially got the Germans fighting on the wrong front a lot of the times. Is anyone in the room from New York State? Are you familiar with a place called Aglo? So it doesn't exist. This is another nice example of deception, right? So in the early 1930s, before satellites were producing maps, before Google Maps came on the scene, map making was an onerous endeavor, right? If you think about how difficult it would be to map America with an army of people, there's a lot to it. So in the early days of map making, there was a company called General Drafting Company who produced the map you see up here. And they would send people around the country to produce these maps. And because they were so difficult to produce, what happened was a lot of other map makers would look at existing maps and simply plagiarize them. Because a place is pretty static, right? It doesn't change too much over time. So what does it matter if I copy someone else's map? Essentially, we're just showing the same sort of thing. So General Drafting Company put in a copyright trap, as they call it, into their maps. So Aglo. It took two of the guys who were producing the map, they took their name and put it together. And they produced this map, they published it, and then they sat and waited. And sure enough, just 5 years later, there was a company called Rand McNally, who also produced maps at the time. This showed up. Aglo New York showed up in their map. And it was actually, I mean, even though it was publicized in deception, this actually showed up on Google Maps for a short time as well. So not even the big giants who have got hundreds of satellites at their disposal were able not to miss that. In the UK, so this is a picture taken from what we call the A to Z map. So it essentially maps all the streets in London. And there's a rumor, although it has been substantiated now, that they have what we call trap streets in these maps. So again, copyright traps that don't exist in real life, that have been designed to catch people out who go in and try and copy their maps. And it's not just unique to the print world, right? So I run a website, it maps the values of vintage guitars. And it's a big database of prices. And one afternoon I noticed the traffic to the website spiking up, right? There was suddenly 5,000% more views to the website. And I get a very small number of views normally anyway. So it was quite exciting. When I looked into it, it was all coming from the same person, right? Someone was scraping my content and putting it onto their own website. So I thought, how do I deal with this? Do I put in place some sort of rate limiting, or do I try and identify this person and block them? But the IP was changing, and the ways in which they were scraping was changing with each run. So what I did is just put fake records in the database, right? It's like this content was stolen from. Because these people are doing it in an automated fashion, right? They're not looking at the results. They're simply cloning it and sticking it into their own database. And these guys were selling it on as well for money. So all I did, and this was all public, just put in a Google alert for the term I'd used. And every time these guys were copying my work, it would just flag up. And I would get an email to say, hey, this is someone copying your work. And I would send them a friendly email to say, hey, why are you plagiarizing my work? I'll take legal action. And sure enough, it's very quickly taken down. And this idea of fictitious entry, I mean, it's nothing new. It's been around for a long time. If you look on Wikipedia, the entry for fictitious comes up with lots of nice synonyms. So we have things like Mount Weasel, which was taken from an encyclopedia where they invented a woman called Victoria Mount Weasel. And Nil article, so that essentially translates from German, from nothing article. But essentially, copyright traps have been a good way to catch people out. Another question for the room, does anyone know who this guy is? No? So this is a guy called Clifford Stoll, if that rings any bells. So this is him testifying before Congress in I think 1989. So he wrote a really famous book called The Cuckoo's Egg. If you haven't read it, I would definitely recommend it. It essentially documents his story of finding someone who's infiltrated his network. So he used to work for Berkeley University, and he noticed suspicious activity on the network, through to realizing the person who had infiltrated their network was actually infiltrating many networks across the country, including very sensitive government assets. And he was probably one of the first examples of the deployment of a honeypot, or the first person to deploy what we now would call a honeypot in today's world. So he commandeered 50 terminals from around his laboratory one weekend and set them up to try and catch the person and learn a bit more about what the person was looking for on his network. So using those 50 terminals, he tracked that person through them and tried to get a picture of what they were looking for. Right? He would observe what files they were opening, what directories they were navigating to, what they were opening on the system, in an attempt to learn more about the hacker. And honeypots have developed over time to include elements of that. Right? There's lots of honeypots that exist today, with the idea of once someone's breached your network, or once someone's trying to look for something, they take you away from the high-value targets into a honeypot, so that they can either be contained or controlled or monitored. And here at Anomali, we have our modern honey network. For those of you who don't know, the modern honey network is a really simple way to deploy a lot of very well-known honeypots. So it's a simple script that will deploy them. And we have our own deployment of these honeypots around the world, also within our own network. And I did last year, it was in January, I was monitoring the activity on these honeypots, and we got 85 million hits. So 85 million, I would call them attacks. Not all of them are attacks, but 85 million hits to these honeypots. If you do a Google search for the Honey Network, you'll find this, and you can download all the packages. But I won't speak too much more about that. The problem with honeypot...
85 million hits over how many sensors?
50 sensors.
Thank you.
Yep. The problem with honeypots and the modern honey network is a lot of people don't put much time into them. They simply grab the binary, install it, and let it run, which is really easy to detect. Here's a showdown search for a term mousefactory. So there's a honeypot called Compot. It mimics an industrial control system. So it's meant to mimic power plants or energy plants. And the default setting comes with a plant ID called mousefactory. And you can see there's 168 entries just in a simple showdown search from mousefactory. So immediately as an attacker, I can see that these are honeypots. And a lot of the time, it's very easy to identify a honeypot for this reason. In fact, Showdown has something they call a honey score, which actually rates an asset by how much it thinks it's a honeypot. So it'll say, hey, out of 100, this scores 70. So we think there's a chance it might be a honeypot. So honeypots then started to evolve, and the concept of a honey token came into place. So whereas a honeypot is an actual well, not a physical machine, but is a machine or designed to mimic a machine, a honey token is really just an asset of some sort, or it's not necessarily a computer, it's just a piece of information. So honey tokens might include email addresses or files, for example. Right? So you might place a file on your network, right? Anomali customer list, and then monitor if people are opening it, right? If people are opening it, why are they opening it? Who's opening it, right? Again, if there's someone inside your network and they're looking for very sensitive information like customer lists or IP, and they're opening, again, a file that they shouldn't be or should never be opened, that's a big indication to expose them in your network. So again, using this example, this is a file that is got nothing of value in. It's just a Word file with nonsense in. But if it's touched, I can see that it's been touched. And because it's a benign bit of information. I want to know who's touched it because no one should really be touching it. Similarly, with databases, there's this whole concept of honey tokens in a database, right? I put a fake email in a database, and if that fake email address is then seen anywhere else, it's probably a big indication that my database has been breached at some point, right? So if I come up with a completely unique email that, again, I've just thought of on the spot, stick it in my database, and then I plug in to something like, have I been pawned, to monitor for that email address being seen elsewhere. Again, it's a very nice or a very easy way of identifying that someone's got access to that data that it shouldn't have. Where it gets really interesting, though, is when you combine the two together, right? So you have a honeypot acting as a real system, but also having associated honey tokens used to access that machine. So at home, I've set up a file sharing honeypot. So I have a machine with a file share on, so the actual honeypot itself. It's just a machine designed purely to host the honeypot. But on all the laptops that I own and all the iPads, I have credentials to access that share. So unless you have the credentials, you can't access that share. And again, they're secret credentials, they're not default admin passwords. So what that means is, for someone to access that honeypot, they have to be able to pick up the credentials from one of my local machines or one of my local assets to be able to access it. So I know that anyone who's going to that honeypot and anyone who authenticates to that honeypot has first pulled the information from one of my machines and is also looking to utilize that information. And everyone in my network or everyone who uses my machines knows that these exist and they don't touch them. So what that means is anyone accessing that honeypot is essentially someone malicious, or at least someone that shouldn't be there. Which means I get very few false positive alerts because if it's, as I say, if it's accessed by someone, then I know that they're more than likely malicious. What I do with that then essentially is I'm monitoring the audit logs from that machine, right? So every time someone tries to authenticate, I get a log. So that includes all the nonsense authentications and potentially brute force attempts, but it also includes all the successful attempts. So I have an elk stack that pulls in the logs from that machine, and I can then identify the successful authentications and push them into the Anomali threat platform. Right? So I have my own feed set up that says, hey, whenever there's a successful authentication, capture the IP address of the origin of that request and stick it into Anomali, right? And then I can share it with people, right? I can put it in a trusted circle, or again, I can use it with all the integrations that I have out of the threat platform. I can also, in conjunction with Anomali Enterprise, look back to see if I've seen that IP address anywhere else in my network, right? So let's say, for example, my honeypot catches someone trying to break into it and successfully breaking into it. So I've logged their IP in the threat platform. I also have logs from all my machines that sit inside my house feeding into Anomali Enterprise, right? That includes all my smart connected devices as well as my laptops, which means I can then cross-reference that IP that's accessed the honeypot against all those other assets I own. So I can see if that particular attack is purely located to the machine it's pulled the credentials off, and then the honeypot, but also anywhere else. Because if someone's looking to exploit my network, especially a corporate network, they're going to start looking around. And I want to be able to see if they've been looking around anywhere else and then go hunting them based on where they've been looking. So again, using Anomali Enterprise, I can look back to see where they've been, and I can look across to see where about in the network they've been. And where it gets really interesting, and one area I'm particularly interested in, is this concept of hack back. So this is a real legal grey area at the moment, and there's bills going through Congress about whether hackback is going to be legal or whether it's going to be illegal. Essentially, though, there's some element of hackback going on in a lot of organizations right now. Hackback itself is, I guess, a media glamorized term to some extent. Essentially, all hackback means is when someone is maliciously accessing your machine, you deliver some sort of payload onto their machine to gain further intelligence, right? So you're not necessarily hacking them. I'm not really a big fan of the term, but you're essentially gathering more intelligence about them, right? So if we take the example of a benign file being placed on my machine, so I have a file named Anomali customer lists, and I say if I'm monitoring the logs of people opening that, that's interesting. I can see that someone's opened it who shouldn't have, but I'll only really have an IP address tagged to that. What would be really interesting is if that person opens the file, what if I could run a macro that deploys something to their machine that extracts even more information, right? So I can start pulling intel from their machine to tell me more about them. So I might be able to gather a bit more about their tactics, or who they're targeting, or their procedures, what tools they're using inside of their machine to access my network. And I can also do this, again, just using honeypots or machines, right? I get someone to access a honeypot. As soon as they hit a honeypot, it deploys a payload onto their machine, which can then be used to extract more intelligence about what they're doing and when they're doing it. Where it gets really interesting with this sort of stuff is performing sort of man-in-the-middle type endeavors, in that someone accesses a machine that they shouldn't have, a payload gets deployed, which then controls or gives the illusion of a completely different environment, right? So if someone starts trying to access my network, that sort of man-in-the-middle can show them a completely different bit of information than what's actually on my network. So I can, again, spoof my network and spoof what that person's going to be looking at in real time based on the payload that's being deployed in or on their machine. Which means I can then essentially control where they go, what they're looking at, and how I interact with them. Because the longer I can keep the attacker contained and away from my high-value stuff, I can gather intelligence from them, but I can also protect my network against them. And that wraps up my presentation, I think. So I'll open the floor to any questions.
The term legal gray area. You want to expand on that at all? Expand on that? Because as you well know, it's an issue that applies to people who have to defend themselves sometimes, even from legal companies for spamming you with advertisements. And in many cases, people are tired of it and they're fighting back or hacking back in order to also collect information in order to file a claim against them that who are basically brute forcing them in ways that are, or in many cases, like spamming or slamming. So I'm curious, I'm sure you probably know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yep.
There's a lot of legal gray areas in that area. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so it's one that's evolving quickly. Ultimately, in the UK, for example, there's this whole idea of a Computer Misuse Act. In the UK, if you perform any sort of hackback, you're already breaking the law, right? So to perform any activities like that, you are breaking the law. And as a result, in the UK, for example, none of that goes on. In the US, it's slightly different. As I say, there's acts going through Congress right now that are looking at putting some sort of boundaries in place for what people can and can't do. Now, there's also a lot of startups working in this whole deception world right now that are starting to offer products that kind of do a bit of what I'm doing, but sell it packaged as an enterprise solution. And they're driving the debate a lot. What I would say for the context of this presentation is I'm not advocating hackback. I think at an enterprise level it becomes very blurry because you have compliance teams, you have legal teams in an organization, and when you start telling them that you're deploying things or you're looking to infiltrate other assets outside of the company, that in itself can be a challenge. From an actual legality standpoint, again, I don't know enough about the laws to say what you can and can't do. So the reason I put grey area is simply because I don't want you guys leaving here thinking, oh, that's a great idea, and then someone coming back and saying, hey, you told me I could do this.
I'm totally telling you that you said it was okay.
Yeah. You didn't see the big red disclaimer. But yeah, I think to end that point, no, I think in the sort of next year, 2 years, this sort of stuff will become really hot, and there will be a big discussion, especially in the security community, around this type of activity. Here at Anomali, I mean, we're even talking about it, potential ways to gather more intelligence or better intelligence for our customers. And this is one of the ways we can potentially do that.
Did I not just hear 2 hours ago the UK setting up a 2,000-man operation in order to be offensive in their areas of the UK, and did not the United States just mention their offensive approach to go in and attack and hack according to in order to get back? I mean, it's, all in the last 24 hours, there's been a lot of talk about this offensive behavior that would then fight back or defend back or hack back or hand-to-hand hack. You know, I mean, it seems like it's going in that direction too.
Yeah.
The UK just talked about it just a couple hours ago about setting up full operations to
Yeah, I saw.
offensively.
Yep. Yeah, I don't know enough about that side of things, but yeah, as I say, like I would be almost certain that governments are involved in a hack back to some sort or offensive hacking techniques, right?
As general policy.
Yep.
David,
Yes.
question for you. So the thing about deception is it takes resources, right? If you want to do it good, the reason we're successful in World War II, a lot of people say it because we put so many of our resources towards the deception, okay? Those same resources could have been spent building planes. Instead, they're holding up inflatable tanks. Okay? So and from a cyber perspective, what do you think the balance is towards putting resources towards deception versus putting resources towards other information security? And, you know, what do you think is a healthy balance for organizations of different sizes to implement this law? Because if you get a bunch of honeypots and you ever configure them, you're going to show up on a honeypot list.
Yep.
But if you take all of your CSIRT and you dedicate them towards setting up thousands of honeypots and not managing incidents, right?
Yeah, I think the argument comes down to defensive versus offensive security, right? Traditionally, a lot has been defensive, right? How can we protect ourselves? And here at Anomali, we offer products that do just that, right? For the most part, we were born out of providing intelligence that you can use to protect your networks, whilst also identifying breaches and then potentially using that information for hunting. But primarily, it was a lot around defensive. And I think the mindset still of a lot of the security community, myself included, is very defensive, right? You go for the defensive stuff first, you meet all the compliance requirements around that, and then you potentially think of the offensive stuff as a side. The reason I think the offensive side of things hasn't taken off or is slow to mature is simply because to date, there haven't been many commercialized or very widely known offensive solutions. Honeypots, everyone knows what honeypots do, but as you allude to, the actual time and effort and maintenance required to keep a honeypot network up is really high, to the point where a lot of people might deploy them, they might maintain them, but the noise they're generating just simply is too much that they get abandoned pretty quickly. I think as I say, the market moves, as more people start developing these offensive type tools, that balance will shift. And in all honesty, I think whilst defensive security is good, I think offensive security can probably take a large proportion of the defensive stuff out of the equation. And that if you can contain people inside areas of your network and monitor them, as opposed to protect against them getting in and hoping they'll never access the network, it'll be, you'll get a much better hit rate for the high value stuff, the people really looking to do damage. And again, if you have the tools in place, it'll be a lot easier than it is to do now. So I think that's still some way off, but yeah, I think hopefully going forward, the balance will be readdressed to more of a 50-50 approach.
Yeah. So at what point do you think it warrants an offensive approach as opposed to like nowadays in threat hunter capacities, you can beacon an individual, many agencies and companies alike de-anonymize users. There's lots of tactics you can use that don't require targeting a user with offensive means because like attribution-wise, how do we know that if you're going after someone's infrastructure, that it's actually their infrastructure? When do we make that final decision in your mind of nothing else has worked, we need to go on full offensive?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm not sure I really know the true answer to that. To me, going offensive is just gaining more intelligence, right? Now, as you say, things like beaconing, you can get that sort of stuff today using other techniques. I think it ultimately depends on the type of attacks you're falling victim to, or where you see big gaps in what you're able to pull from machines, right? If beaconing is working, then that's a great approach. And if your threat hunting teams are getting enough intel, then why go with any more? But I would say ultimately, in my view, the more intelligence, the more context you can get about what someone is doing or what they potentially plan to do or what they can do, it adds more context to an investigation, adds more context to the threat hunter looking at a particular incident, right? Whether or not that's used or not, again, it's up to the person performing the investigation. But the more information, in my opinion, is better.
Sorry, I was going to say, does it make more sense to have a type of standard set in place that people have to follow them before they carry out things like that? Or I just like Pepsi on Instagram, so they hack my mom's Facebook or something. Like is there a certain standard we should set in place for stuff like that? If that makes sense at all.
So I'm not 100% sure on what you're asking.
If you're going to the offensive, I used a really bad example, but if your decision is to go into the offensive, right?
Yep.
And we talked about you've gone through all the steps, and you finally say, okay, we have to do that. Is it worth trying to go and then formalize that, or is it better to leave it to that analyst and go, it's kind of up to you?
I don't know the answer. Again, I would say that would differ between organization to organization. I think if you put it in the hands of the analyst, it's a good step. If you give them the opportunity to use that type of thing and they can legally do it without fear of redress, then that's good. But ultimately, if there were some standards in place or some sort of automation that said, hey, when you want to go offensive, we can do that very easily, and something will be triggered, then again, that's equally as good as long as you're getting the intelligence at the end. I think, for me anyway, I don't know enough. It's too early days for me to make a call as to how it should be delivered.
Your name Redwood or Greenwood?
Greenwood, yeah. Seeing if anyone would notice that. So you're most observant.
Are there any
Hey.
particular tools that you were using open source when you were doing anything like that?
So is the question what open source honeypots are you using or are using? For my network, no, I built it myself, so I'm just using a Windows file share. So it's not open source, but it's I can monitor it all from my machines. But I mean, there's tons of honeypots out there. As I say, check out the Modern Honey Network. I think there's about 30 open source honeypots that come in a deploy script for that, and some of them are file shares. But there's a ton of them in there. Amen.
I know you used the word offensive and defensive, but what about countermeasures?
In what sense?
Well, like, attack confidential, red targets have been around for years, low interaction honeypots. How come people aren't, those more commercialized companies aren't pushing that type of technology?
How come they aren't? pushing that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it comes down to the value of intelligence they generate. Like low interaction honeypots tend to generate a lot of noise. And I think for that reason, a lot of commercial companies don't want to pick them up because the market thinks, hey, if I take a honeypot or I take a commercial honeypot that's going to generate a lot of noise, what value is it going to be to me? Is it really worth my money to invest in this over something else?
Deception.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know the answer. I don't know what, as I say, at Anomali we're thinking about that type of thing, but it's something that's never come to fruition. I think the market isn't asking for it yet. Hey, man.
I heard Anomali may be integrating, not integrating, but obtaining and producing a deception feed into the product?
Potentially. I know there's deception technologies out there. So there's a company that I know of called Symmetria that produce essentially honeypots, and they sell them as commercialized packages. We could pull that intelligence into Anomali. So every time a honeypot is accessed in their network, we can pull that into the threat platform. As to whether there's a specific feed generating that into information, I don't know much beyond that. But what I would say to that point is that type of activity is really unique to an organization. I mean, yes, you can push honeypot data into Anomali, and we push our own modern honey network data into Anomali. But it can be very noisy. The real value of the feed data there is the personalization, right? It's unique to you guys or unique to your organization, and very relevant to your organization. So those type of feeds you can pull in using some of the new stuff we're bringing out, like the developer tools, the SDKs. But also, again, there's companies out there that offer commercial solutions that we can pull the intelligence in from.
So that's what I was kind of wondering, if you have this other feed that you're aggregating in with your Anomali subscription, like, is there certain characteristics, certain honeynets, like data that would be relevant to us more so than just the bulk of it that you really noisy that we could maybe filter on when we're bringing it, when we're ingesting it?
At the moment, no. So we have our labs feed, which is our modern honey network feed, which we push into Anomali. But that really is a catch-all. I mean, there's no uniqueness about it. We've simply deployed a load of honeypots, and we're catching attacks to them. The assets themselves have no real context when someone's accessing them, so they're not really victims of targeted attacks. They're really very generalized in the data they're generating. That's not to say it's not useful, because it is, but it's not very tailored. Cool. Well, I think that's a wrap then. Thank you very much, guys.